The air on the 40th floor of Vanguard Holdings had the scent of ambition boiled down to a single metallic note. Printer toner, heated paper, the faint ozone of conditioned air. It was the kind of smell that made people lean closer to spreadsheets and farther from each other. For Lucas Miller, who lived by smell the way other people lived by sight, that metallic note sat on top of everything else like a lid. Under it, threaded through the glass and the coffee and the brisk cologne of men in suits, there were softer things. A hint of stale lasagna from a plastic container, the sweet, steady breath of vanilla from a woman who always carried a travel-sized bottle in her pocket, the damp, honest smell of dirt from a plant he was nursing on his desk. Lucas could tell where a person had been before they spoke. The intern beside him smelled faintly of bus grease and peppermint gum. The senior analyst smelled like cashmere and old whiskey. Brad Thompson's desk smelled like cheap aftershave and stale entitlement. People were honest in the small chemistry clinging to their sleeves. They announced themselves in ways they didn't intend. Lucas listened. He ate cold lasagna under a strip light, fork scraping against plastic, balancing his plate on a stack of printouts while two monitors flashed charts and deadlines. He had perfected this ritual. Heat the lasagna slowly in the break room microwave, save the topmost cheese for last. Inhale the spice the way other people inhaled oxygen. The dish was from a neighbor who ran a small takeaway in his part of town. A lifetime of practice in stretching budget and affection into something edible. It tasted like Sunday evenings back home and debt invoices and the steady smallness of his life, and it steadied him in ways words couldn't. Lucas had long ago learned to be unseen. His education had been a series of erasures, removed commas in school records that said he wasn't worth more, overlooked internships that said he wasn't connected, job applications swallowed by filters that said his address was the wrong side of town. He had learned to fold himself down to the size of a task and let the world pass around him. The first week at Vanguard, someone had commented that he made them think of a houseplant, small, green, trying to metabolize the wrong kind of light. Lucas had smiled, watered his plant, and bought another. The building itself was a glass carcass, a statement in steel and reflection that reflected everything and nothing. Inside, hierarchies were as visible as the floors on the elevator panel. Lower down, the junior associates squeezed into open-plan offices like a shoal of fish. Higher up, the floors were private. Card-swiped doors, guarded lifts, people who never had to touch the photocopier. Lucas's desk sat somewhere in between, an intern's island in a sea of polished surfaces. He had been assigned to the mergers team to scrub numbers for the pending Eastbridge merger, a quarter's worth of projections that could make or break livelihoods. That was the kind of job that smelled like pressure. He could have missed it. He could have been the kind of intern who kept his head down and let the day swallow him whole. Instead, he had stayed because he liked numbers the way others liked music, patterns singing back to him if he listened long enough. At 2 a.m., with the floor reduced to 1 or 2 cleaning staff and the security guard's radio occasionally paging the empty corridors, colors on his screen grew sharp enough to cut. The graph splitting the liability column threw off a rhythm he recognized. The line didn't belong. A decimal that should have been a comma. An allocation switched between entities. A small mistake. In most places, a small mistake would stay small. At Vanguard, a small mistake could be a headline. He almost missed the woman who said it out loud. "I think your line is broken." She was near his desk with a broom over her shoulder, a utilitarian jumpsuit that had seen better decades, a small name patch that said Rosa in block letters. A scarf knotted at her throat, a faint trace of vanilla at the collar. She moved with careful, practiced steps, the sort of quiet steadiness that belonged to someone who had learned to give rooms back to people who had spilled them. Her hands were work thick. She had a ring at the base of her finger, simple and practical, and a posture that suggested competence rather than submission. Lucas looked up, fingers poised over a keyboard. The office felt suddenly smaller, as if someone had removed a sheet from a window. "Which line?" he asked. He tried not to say please. Civility sometimes smelled like old coffee and the way it pooled in the break room. Lucas wanted the correction without the favor. She pointed not with a finger but with the tip of a broom. "See where the liabilities spike? That shouldn't be there unless Eastbridge has a contingent asset. But your memo says they don't. Someone pushed a value across the wrong ledger. Look at the timestamps. It's not just a human error, someone did it after hours. Lucas blinked at the graph on his screen, at the numbers that were suddenly different because someone had observed them. The vanilla in the air wrapped around his chest. How did you? She shrugged, a small, almost embarrassed motion. I clean this floor, I listen. Numbers hum if you clean the right room. Her voice was careful. It suggested a woman who had never wanted to be noticed and had grown adept at the art nonetheless. You should check column 4. The decimals shifted. It affects the quarterly cash position. He cross-referenced, heart stepping out of rhythm. The decimal migrated like a tiny saboteur. If it stayed, the projections would misrepresent Vanguard's liquidity ahead of the merger call. Investors would read it, the board would react, rumors would leak. He should have saved, sent a note to his manager, blocked a time for a senior to sign off. Instead, Lucas did what he knew how to do best. He corrected the ledger, running a series of small reconciliations, re-tagged the anomalous entry, wrote a clear note attached to the memo, and emailed the required people with trembling, competent hands. Brad Thompson, who had the kind of voice that flattened corridors and a jawline that lent itself to threatening smirks, walked by just as Lucas hit send. "What are you doing at this hour, kid?" he asked, voice dipped in the assumed boredom of power. His desk smelled as usual like the bright sour cologne of a man who believed everything owed him something. Lucas didn't raise his head. He'd learned to keep his eyes on the screen and on his compost of patience. Finishing the Eastbridge reconciliation, he replied, found a misplaced entry, sent a note to legal and finance. Brad huffed like a small gust of wind. "Make sure you don't overstep. This is senior work." The implied threat sat between them like a dropped glass. Lucas felt it, an old reflex from classrooms and exploitative internships, someone reminding him of his place. Rosa, who was straightening a potted fern by the copy room, didn't look up. She set the fern down and walked over, steadiness like a metronome. "He fixed it," she said plainly. "It wouldn't have broken like that on its own." Brad's face narrowed. He didn't like being seen making mistakes. He certainly didn't like being corrected by a woman who, in his estimation, should be invisible. He leaned in closer to Lucas's desk, the smell of his aftershave filling Lucas's space. "Listen, kid, this isn't your problem. Focus on your own series. Don't get timpaned in senior chaos." He used the opportune word, meant to intimidate, to show a degree of worldliness. In the dictionary of his threats, intimidation counted as success. Lucas had that moment, small and sharp, where the weight of every inherited insignia pressed against his throat. He could let it slide. He could let the tide of the office wash him back to insignificance. Or he could make a sound that said simply, "No." He straightened his shoulders. "Someone would have seen it later," he said. "Better to catch it now." His voice didn't quiver. It barely rose. It was the kind of measured thing people who had been invisible for so long used when they decided not to be. Brad smirked, all teeth and assumptions. "Says who, you?" he mocked. "We manage more than just columns here. Keep your head down." Rosa's eyes flicked from Brad to Lucas and back, the vanilla scent as steady as a heartbeat. She did not speak. What she did was something else. She stopped for a second, reached into the pocket of her jumpsuit and placed something small on the desk. A hand-wrapped bundle, unmistakably a piece of lasagna, clumsily reheated earlier and then tucked back into foil. Her hands were clean from work. The lasagna carried the warmth of necessity. "For later," she said simply to Lucas. "You'll need it." It ought to have been nothing, an offer of food, but it landed like a bulletproof coat. Lucas felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with the reports Brad's mouth curled in amusement. "What next? Are we sharing therapy sessions?" He turned away, his voice trailing. "Watch him, people. He acts like he owns a ledger." Rosa didn't look flinched. She folded her hands careful around the broom, an old woman with new patience. "Some people just notice things," she said to no one and to everyone. "You can't own a ledger the way you own a car, Mr. Thompson. It's not property. It's responsibility. That little phrase, responsibility, stayed with Lucas in a way ethics classes and corporate mottos had not. The building hummed around them. The cleaning crew's cart squeaked. The air conditioning rattled in a way that sounded like a faraway train. Lucas wrapped the lasagna in a napkin and slid it into his drawer. He bleached his hands in the bathroom sink because hand washing had always made fear feel less permanent. By the time he left that night, the office had emptied like a bottle poured all the way out. The lobby lights were dimmed. A janitor wheeled a final trash bin past the glass doors. Outside, a storm had been brewing. London did that, building pressure that cracked into rain. The first drop smelled like the sea. Lucas held his umbrella over his head. The lasagna cooled in his bag to lukewarm relevance. When he walked home on public transit, the city hummed and smelled like wet tar and the faint compost of subway stations. He thought about decimals and about the woman with vanilla in her pocket who had corrected him. A week later, Vanguard's internal thread lit up with thank you notes. Someone on the board had noticed the corrected memo. Someone with a magnified timeline and a concern over public perception had sent a short, crisp email. Thanks to Lucas M. for catching the discrepancy. It was a small commendation, an electronic pat, but it mattered. When people at work began to see his name pop up, their glances changed from flat to surprised. He felt, irrationally, a small warmth. He told his mother over the phone, who laughed and told him not to let it go to his head. "Eat, Lucas," she said. "Don't stay awake fixing what isn't broken." The cleaning woman kept appearing. Her nameplate read Rosa, but she signed her notes with a neat professional hand when she left a sticky on a manager's door. Cleaned pantry, replaced bulbs, water for plant on 10th floor. She had ways of being present without demanding attention. Lucas found, in odd moments between ledgers and late nights, that she would appear with a cloth and a comment. She asked about his plant, and he told her about the brown spots and the runty new leaf. She brought him white coffee once, which was, to him, a revelation. The coffee had been warmed with a drop of vanilla. "For the taste of home," she said. He tasted a softness that might have been kindness or strategy, or simply someone who liked to give what she had. The building, in its quiet, held eyes that were not always the board's. Patterns revealed themselves to those who had time to notice. Rosa's broom and the vanilla bottle were small things. The way she stacked receipts in a neat order that mimicked ledger columns, the way she hummed under her breath when she walked past the glass conference rooms, the way she paused at the 40th floor copy machine like someone who owned familiarity rather than title. Observers noticed nothing and everything. Lucas started to see her as an island of warmth. She would press a wrapped sandwich into his hands. She taught him once how to press the leaves of the plant in his office in the right way so they would not kink. She told him that plants needed conversation. He started to speak to his fern. Brad did not go away. Entitlement has a way of inflating when bruised. He tried to appropriate the credit for the reconciliation in a meeting, standing at the front like a man performing ownership. He liked to talk loudly of leadership in ways that smelled like cheap cologne. When Lucas corrected an offhand line in a public projection, Brad tried to flatten him with words. The room had the shape of a courtroom. Lucas, who knew how to carry fear under his ribs like a hidden engine, spoke up on his own terms. He explained the fix, methodically and without flourish. The room shifted. Someone on the senior bench made a small, approving note. Brad, whose instincts were to shove down anyone who might climb higher, made a public brittle joke and left, but not before slamming his palm against his laptop in a way that made the screen flicker. It was only after this, after Lucas had faced down the cheap roar of a corporate alpha, that his world tilted in a way that made things move faster. A meeting was called the next morning, and Lucas found himself in the conference room with the windows that looked over the river like a slick memory. The board members were there, all the correct names on their badges, and at the head, where the leather chairs absorbed light, sat a woman he had never seen in person on the intern floor, but whose existence was part of company lore. Donna Maria Vahan. People said her name with a mixture of reverence and fear. She was not only Dominic Vahan's mother, She was the architect of the family's holdings, a presence in philanthropic circles, an investor whose verdicts shaped futures. Photographs existed, formal and cold, on the company website. Donna Maria at galas, Donna Maria giving speeches. To see her across a polished table, ungloved hands resting on papers, was to step into a different axis of the company's gravity. But she was not alone. She was, improbably, alone in the way of a woman who had decided to notice something for herself. The chair across from her was empty. Lucas's heart misaligned in his chest like a faulty gear. He had been asked to present what he'd done. He gathered his papers like a soldier preparing a small human flag. "Mr. Miller," she said, and the name rolled over her tongue with something like an assessment. Her voice lacked pretension. "You fixed a misallocated entry." Lucas felt small in the room, the way you feel when you realize you are being fit to see if you will break. He answered. He explained the decimal, the timestamps, the reconciliation process. He did not embellish. He had been raised on modesty and accurate measures. The truth felt like a clean thing. When he finished, the room breathed as if someone had let pressure out of a balloon. Donna Maria's eyes were sharper than he expected. She watched from behind glasses that cut light into clear planes. "You didn't ask permission to touch senior work," she observed. "You did it because the numbers asked to be noticed." It was not a question. It was a filing of something that mattered into her ledger of people. Before Lucas could process what else she might say, an old familiar presence entered the room like a shadow fulfilling a promise. Dominic Vahan. He moved with the kind of economy of motion that had likely been practiced for decades, the alpha ease of someone who had always been in command. He smelled of cashmere and storm, a cologne that carried the suggestion of rain and the dry burn of executive certainty. He paused on the threshold and looked at Lucas in a way that made the air press in. There was curiosity there, a fact-finding expression that made observation feel intimate. Dominic had never been surprised by the banal things that made life, the ruthlessness of markets, the tact of negotiations. But people could surprise him. He had not expected to find a cleaning woman on the 40th floor who smelled like vanilla. He certainly had not expected to find a cleaning woman remarking on a graph. And he had, until this day, not expected to step into a conference room where his mother, who had been alive in headlines for decades, would be sitting across from a junior intern with a packet of reconciliations. "Lucas," Dominic said, and his voice carried across the room like an announcement. "Tell me, how did you come to notice this?" Lucas's throat tightened. He answered succinctly, refusing to become performative. He explained the line, the discrepancy, the timestamps. He told the room about Rosa, careful not to ascribe decisions he hadn't made to her. Donna Maria smiled then, a movement that suggested a gate opening. "Rosa has a particular way of seeing," she said to the table as much as to Lucas. Then she leaned forward and removed something that would change the room's temperature, a pair of work gloves from her lap. She had been wearing no gloves earlier in the photos the company had. But here, in this impossible off-script moment, she slid them free and set them down like a demonstration. There was a short suspended breath in the room. Lucas watched the woman's hands, the same hands that had likely signed donations and sealed contracts. The gloves were work-stained. They belonged to a person accustomed to the glow of stage lights, now wearing the warp and weft of labor. Slowly, like someone setting down a mask, Donna Maria drew back the scarf at her throat, revealing not the opera hair and pearls that seemed to make up her public face, but the careful lines of someone who had deliberately chosen to be unseen. "You were there," she said softly, and the object in her voice was a revelation. "You were the cleaning lady on the 40th floor." The room's breath shifted. People were adept at explanations. Rumors and clarifications spun, but there was a specific kind of disbelief that came when a person you imagined in one key rearranged themselves before you. Rosa, Donna Maria, smiled with the half-memory of a woman who had once hid in plain sight to understand what people meant when they talked about dignity. Lucas's mind tried to reassemble the last months into a string that made sense. He remembered her broom, the vanilla, the way she had set a piece of lasagna on his desk. He remembered the name patch and the careful tuck of her hair. He had not believed in miracles, he had not been asked to. Now the miracle was a woman stepping out of costume. Dominic's expression was something like thunder held at bay. He had been the kind of man who expected to know the shape of his world. His mother had always been part of its scaffolding, secretly monitoring, quietly decisive. That she had cleaned the 40th floor was not an act of folly. It was an act of a deliberate intelligence. He had suspected protocol violations before, but this was maternal strategy in motion. Why? Dominic asked. And it was less of a demand than a question that had been sitting in his jaw for weeks. He was careful in his words. Mother, why are you cleaning our floors? Donna Maria inclined her head. There is a kind of truth people accept because it's forged ahead of them. She spoke plainly. Because I wanted to see how people treated what they thought was beneath them. I wanted to see who noticed the small things when no one else was looking. It sounded like a child's moral, distilled into policy language. But the room understood the implications. She had sat in cafeteria corners disguised as a cleaning woman in other firms before, sources said. She had learned patterns of compassion and cruelty in wholesale ways that made her board decisions nuanced. To her this was not manipulation, but reconnaissance. She turned her gaze back to Lucas. You were kind to the place you work in, she said. You corrected an entry because it needed correction, not because you sought credit. That matters. Dominic's jaw clenched. He stepped closer to the table until the leather chair creaked in protest. The storm in his cologne had sharpened into something like a question meant only for the air between them. Did he know? Had he suspected? Had he imagined his mother walking corridors in a jumpsuit? He had seen her in gala lighting and museum wings, but not like this. The realization hit him like a recalibration. He had until this moment never considered that a person on his floor, the one who smelled of vanilla and whose hands had thickened with honest labor, might be someone who moved chess pieces in high places. Donna Maria, unafraid, gave a small, private smile. I am not here to interfere in your mergers, Dominic, she told him. I am here to test the skin of the company, to see who protects the small things, the numbers, the people, the dignity. And if I find someone I think belongs higher, I will make sure they are seen. The board members blinked as if a light had been switched on. Disbelief rearranged into a dozen new judgments, some resentful, some measuring. Dominic was the only one who seemed to fold something inward, a private ledger entry updating itself. He looked at Lucas with an intensity that was almost indecent in its directness. Lucas felt it like sunlight held too close. Would you like to work with me directly? Dominic asked, and there was no display of superiorship in the offer. Only a clean, expeditious opening that could not be misread. Lucas's mind spun. Work with the CEO sounded like a headline. It sounded like life unstitched from its meager hems. It sounded like stepping into a new smell, cashmere and rain, and the risk of being seen by people who counted. It sounded like 1,000 things that rearranged him from the inside. Yes, he heard himself say. It was a small, irrevocable word. It lay on the table like something tender that might be picked up or crushed. The early applause was absent. Donna Maria simply nodded. We'll make arrangements, she said. Then she added, as if marking a different kind of truth. And Rosa will continue to be Rosa. The room shifted. People tried to reconcile an elder matriarch who cleaned with the fact that she had been directing outcomes, quietly. Brad scowled. Someone in HR scribbled notes. Dominic folded all of that into a look that was almost unreadable. For Lucas, whose life had been a series of back rooms and uncredited labor, the moment felt like a humid door opening onto a larger air. When he left the conference room, people parted in small waves, some curious, some prickly. He carried the echo of vanilla with him, as if the woman had branded him with a scent that would later be a map. He knew, because he smelled it, that his life would change. He did not quite know in what ways it would shift. Outside, the storm had broken fully. Rain drummed down the glass like a second, more honest percussion. When he stepped out into the chill, vapor rose from the sidewalk and looped around his coat. He hugged the lasagna to his chest and thought of his mother waiting on the other end of the transport line. Her small house, the fields they'd visit on weekends, the way she made dumplings with hands that had never had a corporate identity. She would laugh when he told her about the offer. "Walk careful, Lucas," she would say. "The world will want to polish you." Before he could move, a hand fell lightly on his elbow. He turned to find Rosa, Donna Maria, standing there in the drizzle, the scarf at her throat wet at the edges, eyes bright with something like approval. Up close he could see the fine lines along her hands and the quickness that marked kindness. She smelled, as always, lightly of vanilla and the outdoors. "You did well," she said. "You could be careful and still brave. That's rarer than they think." Lucas nodded. "Thank you." She watched him for a long moment, as if trying to measure the particular grain of his soul. "You'll find the 50th floor is colder than the 40th, she said, a simple domestic observation that carried with it an animal knowledge. "Bring a scarf, and keep the plant." He blinked. "I will." She smiled then, again that private warming smile, and turned to walk away, her broom leaning against an arm like an instrument of measure. It's the way people who move between worlds tend to do. They stay long enough to make a mark, and then vanish back into categories that others have assigned them. Lucas stood in the rain and let it run through him, washing off the metallic lid the building had left. He thought of the 50th floor like a possible new universe, a place with fewer open doors and more windows looking onto the river. He thought of the smell he would carry, vanilla threaded through his days like the seam of a story. He thought, oddly and urgently, of the plant on his desk and the lasagna in his drawer. A notification blinked across his phone. An HR email confirming his relocation to the executive support team, effective in 2 weeks, and an invitation to a preliminary meeting. Nothing about salary was on the note. There was a line about non-disclosure, and another politely framed sentence, "Welcome." He closed his phone with a thumb that trembled a little. For someone who had spent life learning to be unseen, being noticed felt less like being found, and more like being called. It was a pressure and a promise. That evening, in the small flat he shared with the certainty of debt, he reheated the lasagna in the microwave. Steam rose, smelling of tomato and basil, and the way ordinary kitchens held up small miracles. He sat at his table and ate with both hands at once, the electricity of the day making his fingers tremble. He thought of the woman who'd been a cleaning lady and then been a public figure. He thought of Dominic's look like a storm holding its breath. There were things he wanted to ask and things he would not articulate yet. There were old lessons about visibility and new ones forming like seedlings. Somewhere, high above, Donovan Vahan returned to his floor and to the closed, meticulous work of the company. He sat in an office lined with plants, an incongruous touch. Dominic liked greenery. It softened the sterile edges and smelled like rain. And he turned over the memory of the intern before him. He recalled the way Lucas had not bowed but had instead met the accountancy of error with clear hands and the small dignity of correction. Dominic had watched him do something rarer than competence. He had watched him show courage without wanting to show off. It was a trait Dominic respected because it answered to an ethic he admired. He thought of his mother like a force that moved in planes that were less visible. He'd always known she had an appetite for testing systems. He had not expected the test to land him in the position of having to decide what to do next. He felt, for the first time in a long while, a crack in the thing he'd built, a crack that smelled like possibility. Back in Lucas's tiny kitchen, the lasagna finished and the trash tucked away, he allowed himself a moment to look at the plant he'd rescued from the brink. The leaves had perked up a bit more this week. He touched one and felt the small, reassuring firmness of life. He would bring a scarf to the 50th floor. He would take the plant. He would try to learn the rules of being seen without being consumed. Outside, rain cleaned the city's edges. The night smelled of whetstone and new beginnings. He didn't yet know how his life would rearrange itself around the name Dominic Vahan, or what it meant that Donna Maria had been both Rosa and the woman in the boardroom. He only knew that he had been noticed. Someone had, in a practical and tender way, put down a plate of lasagna and said, without fanfare, that he mattered. If this story is speaking to you, stay with it. Like and subscribe for more original BL stories. 2 weeks later, on the morning of his official transfer, Lucas rode the elevator with a stack of documents and a plant in a careful box. The lift moved up, the numbers on the panel clicking like heartbeats. On the 50th floor, the light was different, less exposed and more deliberate. Dominic met him at the door with the economy of a man who did not do extraneous gestures. He wore a dark coat that smelled faintly of storm air and something softer, old books and cashmere. In his hand he held a slim leather portfolio. They walked down the corridor toward a glass office that smelled faintly of coffee and something green, plants from Dominic's hidden grove. He noticed Lucas's hands, the way they held the plant box like someone carrying a new, vulnerable life form. Dominic's gaze lingered on the lasagna residue on the corner of a napkin in Lucas's bag, the domestic mark that made the city feel not so indifferent. "Your desk is ready," Dominic said, and it was more than an announcement of place. "There will be an orientation, there will be a non-disclosure, there will be people who measure the distance between you and others by the size of your coffee cup. Ignore their metrics. Do your work." Lucas nodded. "I will." Dominic's mouth softened at the edges, the tiniest easing that suggested he was not only an alpha, but a man unused to the quiet of something he did not command. "If anything is wrong, tell me," he said. The sentence was short and unexpected. "If you are uncomfortable at any time, tell me. I will not allow anyone to make you feel unsafe." His promise was not possessiveness disguised as protection. It had the shape of someone who understood the responsibilities of power and the thinness of the line between protection and possession. Lucas cataloged the sincerity in Dominic's voice like a careful accountant making note of an asset. He placed the plant on the corner of his new desk and felt, in the quiet, a tiny bloom of something he could not yet name. He had left the other world of penultimate quiet and walked into a different smell of air, one threaded with coffee and the distant scent of vanilla like a remembered song. His move upward was not a finality. It was an invitation into a landscape that could either flatten him or set him in the light. As the morning unfurled and the team filtered in, some curious, some dismissive, Lucas sat with his plant near a window that looked over the river, the city awash of glass and motion below. He kept the lasagna in his drawer for the late hours, more comfort than necessity. He thought of Donna Maria, who had been a cleaning woman and a power broker, and of Rosa, an alias that felt both like shelter and weapon. He tried to understand why a woman with the means to command would choose to sweep floors. Across the suite, Brad's expression soured into a predictable scowl when he learned that the junior intern had been elevated. Mark, a colleague whose smile carried an undertow of ambition, made a show of congratulations that smelled like negotiation. There would be tests, there would be small cruelties. Lucas was not naive. He had been on the edge of life enough to know the knives existed. He had also, surprisingly often, known how to wield his own small acts of courage. Near noon, a new package arrived at his desk. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a small potted plant, a cutting of something green and soft, the kind that could root in a modest pot and learn how to thrive. A note came with it in a clean, precise hand. "Welcome to the 50th. D." Lucas smelled the paper, a faint trace of the same storm and cashmere cologne, and felt his fingers go warm. The plant was a kind of informal handshake. He placed it beside his fern and thought of how easily people created meaning out of small gestures. The day carried the usual business of numbers and memos, but under it there was an undercurrent of newness. He met Dominic briefly in the late afternoon, both of them standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that watched the river slide by. The sky had the metallic smell of an oncoming storm, like a great inhalation. Dominic's hand brushed his arm accidentally, the detail small and electrifying. Lucas felt sharply the immediate difference of their worlds. Dominic's presence carried with it an authority that made people step into different shapes, while Lucas's presence carried a hunger that was quieter and steadier. "How are you settling?" Dominic asked, his voice a small current. Lucas looked at his plant, then at the city's ribbon of water. "Okay," he said. "It's a lot, but okay." Dominic's mouth tilted in an offhand attempt at humor. "The 50th floor doesn't hand out spare hearts," he said. "You keep yours, Mr. Miller. You decide where you give it." Lucas swallowed, surprised at the intimacy of the sentence. It was not a command. It was an offering of an ethic, wrapped in a human tone. He wondered as the storm outside poured itself into the city's gutters, whether being noticed would also be being wanted. When he left that night, the city had the late smell of rain and the possibility of a night that kept its edges soft. He walked home with his small pot of plant, and the residue of a day stretched thin with attention. He had been noticed before, and had been taken for granted. This felt different because the notice had come with a name and a scent, and a woman who had been both Rosa and a matriarch. It felt like a seed placed carefully in soil. There was distance between the 40th and the 50th, between the cleaning cart and the leather chair, between an offer and the weight of being seen. Lucas did not know what the future would demand of him. Loyalty, cunning, the ability to navigate a room where mother and son were two axes of consequence. He only knew that he had been given a chance, and that someone with a broom and vanilla had made sure the world saw him. Down in the countryside, his mother folded dough into dumplings and hummed the old songs. Lucas, down in the countryside, his mother folded dough into dumplings and hummed the old songs. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light sifting through curtains that smelled of sun-warmed linen and yeast. The radio, low on the counter, played a station that kept time in another country, one where deadlines were a rumor and storms were counted by the number of sheep in the lane. He watched his mother's hands move, flour dusting the air in pale clouds, and for the first time in weeks felt like a human who could be cared for, rather than a ledger waiting for correction. He had come to apologize to himself for the rumor of fear that had lived in his chest. An apology made in the only currency his family understood: practical care. His father was at the co-op, but sent him a text picture of chickens pecking at early grass. His sister left a half-emptied jar of elderflower jam in the refrigerator. The house smelled of stock and bread, and when his mother placed a steaming bowl of dumplings in front of him, he ate until the hunger that had been tangled with anxiety loosened. He told them the bare outlines of the transfer, the 50th floor, the plants, the woman who had been both cleaning lady and the matriarch of the company. He did not tell them everything. He did not tell them the way Dominic's presence altered the architecture of a room, or how the smell of cashmere and storm seemed to lay out territorial maps on people's shoulders. He did not say that sometimes, when he closed his eyes at night, he could still feel the tremor of being noticed, an odd, delicate pain. His mother patted his hand. "Bring your coat," she said, not because she feared storms, but because she had learned how to make people warm. "And call if you are overwhelmed. There is no shame in a train ticket back." He laughed at that, small and brittle, but the laugh was real. They spoke of dumplings and the state of the vegetable patch and how the neighbor's dog had finally learned to stop stealing cabbages. In the steadiness of the cottage, he practiced the quiet acts he would need if he wished to survive the new world he was entering: folding clean socks, fixing a loose button on his favorite jacket, learning to fold dumpling dough into a shape that could be held like a promise. When he returned to the city, he felt oddly fortified. The 50th floor received him with the same crispness as before, but there was a margin to his day now carved out by returned smells and tastes. He kept the little potted cutting on his windowsill, where it caught the river light, and every morning he watered it and felt himself watering a part of his own life. Proximity did what pages of corporate training could not. It dissolved distance in small domestic measures. Dominic's invitations were seldom grand. They were the kind that occupied ordinary hours, the kind that quietly reshaped habits. He began to leave things on Lucas's desk: a thermos of coffee marked with an unpretentious square of masking tape, a gray cashmere scarf folded in a precise rectangle, once a small tin of vanilla biscuits that smelled faintly like the cleaning woman's scarf had weeks ago. Each item carried the careful consideration of someone who had learned that affinity is expressed in the acts that make lives easier. Dominic watched Lucas as if taking notes that were not for the boardroom. He watched the way Lucas tended the plants, the way he straightened a stack of papers until the edges were patient. He called him in for late-night strategy meetings and, in between slides and legal disclaimers, would offer a bowl of leftover stew or ask, in the unspectacular tone of a man arranging the world, "Do you want the window open?" Lucas learned Dominic's rhythms. He learned the way Dominic would hover near the moleskin notebook when something caught at his attention, and how he kept his hands precise when he was nervous. No theatrics, just small, economic gestures. Dominic's restraint was plain and deliberate. When coworkers tried to push boundaries, when Mark's tone edged too intimate in a conversation, or when a late-night party invitation carried a kind of expectation, Dominic's responses were short and administrative. He would say, "We keep professional boundaries," and then, if necessary, he would bring in HR. That administrative insistence made Lucas feel safer in a way he had not anticipated. It was not possession masquerading as protection. It was policy first, care as a secondary structure. There was a moral clarity to it. Dominic treated consent like a rule to be respected, rather than a line to be flirted with. Brad, however, did not accept policies as easily as others. Resentment flared into targeted cruelty. He began to use moments of public performance to undermine Lucas, deliberately mislabeling a slide that Lucas had prepared, making a pointed joke about interns who overreach. Brad's voice had always been an effort at authority. Now it carried the sharpened intent of someone who felt his own power threatened by being outshone. In a meeting meant to finalize a section of the Eastbridge integration plan, Brad placed a flawed spreadsheet on the screen and remarked, loud enough for others to hear, "This is the kind of thing junior analysts put on the board when they want to be noticed." A smothered laugh rolled through half the room. Lucas felt his face warm, but this time the warmth did not make him fold. He stood up, not theatrically, not to perform, simply because the numbers deserved correction. "That's an incorrectly linked cell," he said, voice calm. "It inflates the projected synergies." Brad's smirk was a blade. "And you think you can fix it, do you?" he said theatrically, trying to create a spectacle. Before Lucas could answer, Dominic stepped across the front of the room. He placed his palms on the table and said quietly, "This is not a matter of arrogance. It's a matter of accuracy. Fix it, Lucas. Be precise." Dominic's words were small, but their effect was immediate. They were a reminder that the rules belonged to the company's interest, not to someone's ego. Brad shot him a look, an alpha recalibrated by the presence of the boss's favor, and later, in private, launched a smear campaign. He began to whisper that Lucas had been fast-tracked on the back of his mother's politics, that internships should be kept in their lane. He tried to conjure doubt among colleagues who were already looking for an angle. But the board had watched the reconciliation. They had seen the numbers and the integrity of the correction. Dominic, decisive but careful, called a formal meeting with HR. He did not indulge Brad's theatrics. He filed an official complaint, ensured a record, and asked for a mediation. The HR representative arrived, in their neutral tone, and Brad was told to cease targeted comments and to attend coaching. When the coaching produced further incivility, snide remarks overheard in the corridors and a deliberate misattribution of Lucas's work, Dominic took a step that made the atmosphere crackle. He recommended Brad's removal from the merger team pending an investigation. The company could not afford reputational risk, and Dominic could not tolerate petty sabotage where people's livelihoods were at stake. Brad was escorted out of a meeting by a security officer. The escorting was quiet and methodical, not dramatic. The company archived the incident as an HR matter. Rumors always feed themselves, but the facts, when presented with weight, tended to sink them. There were consequences. Brad's overreach became a cautionary note in the suite. For every small cruelty he tried, policy closed the door. That clarity altered the tenor of the floor. People who had been feeling the shape of fear began to speak up. Mark, whose earlier smiles had felt like negotiation, watched the sequence and recalibrated. He slid a note across the corridor to Lucas one afternoon, an apology that smelled faintly of coffee and self-preservation, and asked if they could talk. Lucas agreed. They were not friends, but there was a level of respect that the ordeal had edged into being. Not everything in the company had to be a battlefield. Some things could simply be cleaned. One night, Weeks after Lucas's transfer, the two were left to pore over the final drafts of a schedule. The river outside was a dark band, and the city's lights had been pulled close like attracted moths. Dominic and Lucas were in a room with the map of the merger spread across the table, its lines and timelines making a topography of the company's future. They had been talking for hours. The conversation had shifted from graphs to small details. The best way to get the old legal team to sign off. The taste of dumplings that carried a memory. At one point, Dominic stood to fetch a new printout, and his hand brushed the back of Lucas's neck as he moved past. The contact was brief, an accidental charge, but it set Lucas's skin buzzing. The air smelled like storm and the faint tin of cooled coffee. Lucas's heart stuttered. Dominic paused, hand halfway to the cabinet. He looked at Lucas with an expression that was unguarded and almost rueful. The room seemed to narrow to the space with the two of them in it. "We need to be careful," he said softly. "Office lines exist for a reason." Lucas nodded. He understood the rules. He wanted to be careful too. But there was more in Dominic's face than a rule. There was an obvious hunger he had never seen from the man before. An honest, restrained ache that suggested an internal calculus Dominic was not willing to gamble with. They continued with the work. Later, when the rest of the team had left and the lights were down to a dimness that made the river out the window a sheet of obsidian, they packed up together. Dominic folded a thin cashmere scarf and, before he handed it to Lucas, hesitated. "It's cold," he said, the simple sentence carrying weight. Lucas accepted the scarf. The fabric smelled of rain and ledger paper. In a sudden surge of courage he had been practicing, Lucas reached out and took Dominic's hand. One finger, not a grip, a test. Dominic did not pull away. He looked at Lucas like someone deciding between two paths. They stood very close in the quiet, inches not yet crossing the line that could turn possibility into scandal. Dominic swallowed, then, with the caution of a man who had thought of consequence, drew a small step back. "I can't," he said, not because he did not want to, but because he feared the imbalance of power might make any intimacy less than free. "Not like this." The words were an honest, painful thing. To Lucas, they felt like rejection, though he could see in Dominic's expression the moral scaffolding rather than cruelty. Dominic was not retreating out of indifference. He was hesitating because he cared enough to respect autonomy. Lucas felt himself shrink around the hesitation. He had been practicing not to need permission to be loved, but this situation hung on unequal scales. He turned the scarf in his hands and left. He left the 50th floor with the quiet movement of someone whose chest felt like it had been rearranged by the changing of season. That night anxiety clung to him like damp. He tried to sleep. Tried to count leaves and plants the way his grandmother taught him to count blessings. Instead, his body betrayed him. Stress had a way of making his pulse go rogue. He felt the fever rise, a hot, relentless tide that left him hollow in the middle. The world tilted. He thought of the plant on his windowsill and how fragile it looked in the night. Rather than call Dominic and ask for the comfort he might not be able to accept, Lucas did what was familiar and loved. He fled to the place that guaranteed unconditional care. He bought a late train ticket and, in a fever-bright blur, packed a small bag and left the city to the hum of trains and rain. The countryside, with its steady smells of hay and bread and the faint sweetness of cow fields, welcomed him like an apology. He arrived at dawn, stumbling through the kitchen door where his mother barked out a greeting that was both practical and fierce. She took his forehead and then his bag and pressed a bowl of congee into his hands and set him down at the table. He felt the fever as a foreign traitor in his blood. His body was louder than his sense of propriety. Dominic found the absence like a physical thing. The 50th floor seemed suddenly too large. He replayed the night's small failure, how he'd said no to himself in the name of ethics, only to realize that the refusal had been heard differently. Perhaps he thought that protecting Lucas meant distance. Perhaps it had been cowardice in the guise of care. Either way, when the support team could not account for Lucas's absence and his phone went unanswered, Dominic's concern turned into sharp, particular panic. He did what most CEOs could not be accused of doing. He canceled a day of meetings, got in his car, and drove. The countryside was 3 hours of motorway, the city falling away into the ancient geology of smaller towns and hedgerows. As he drove, the memory of Lucas's hands watering a plant kept surfacing. It was a hum that would not be ignored. Donna Maria watched her son leave from the kitchen window with a look she'd had when he was a child, and hid marbles in his fist. She smelled of vanilla and hot tea. She had orchestrated the initial discovery like any director might test an understudy. Not cruelty, but the remaking of a pattern. Now, watching Dominic drive away, she felt the mechanics of her strategy blur into something more human. She had not anticipated the ache that comes with watching the hearts of others blink under exposure. When Dominic arrived at the farmhouse, the scene was domestic and absolute. Lucas slept on the sofa, a blanket tucked up to his chin, steam rising from a cup set on the coffee table. His mother moved around him with the confidence of someone who knew precisely what to do: wash a cloth, bring cool compresses, steam herbal tea. She offered Dominic a bowl of rice and a look that admitted small truths. "You shouldn't have come alone," she said, not unkindly. "It is difficult to cross a city without senses." Dominic took the cool cloth in both hands as if it were a lit object. He sat down at the edge of the sofa and watched Lucas's chest rise and fall like the tide. Up close, Lucas smelled like something Dominic had only known from memory: vanilla and dumpling broth and a faint trace of the city's river. Dominic's hands trembled once. He laid them flat on his knees, a man restraining anything that might be called rash. Later, in a room where the windows held the countryside's light like a painting, Dominic spoke. He did not make grand declarations at first. He told Lucas where he had failed, that in his attempt to be ethically unassailable he had been emotionally absent, that he had thought distance would be a gift, but had instead become a wall. He said the truth of his privilege, how he had the power to shape a company and how that shape could press on a person's life like a thumb on soft clay. Lucas listened, half asleep and half awake. He had imagined every possible cruelty: that Dominic would be dismissive, that he would be embarrassed, that the man would demand loyalty as payment for his kindness. Instead, Dominic offered something unusual. He said plainly, "I don't want you to be here because you feel indebted to me, nor because you feel admired in a way that costs you your dignity. If you are not sure, I will make a choice that takes that power away." The currency of that promise was simple and terrifying. Dominic told him he was willing to step back from the executive front, resign, move into an advisory role, anything that would reorganize the power dynamics. It was, as his mother later said, dramatic. But it was also honest. "Do not ask me to move mountains without telling me first," Dominic admitted. "But if the only way you can be with me is by having me actively step away from this position of authority, I will do it. I will risk my reputation rather than have you feel obliged." Lucas felt the words like rain after drought. Tears blurred the edges of his vision, not because the words were heroic, but because they were clear. He thought of the plant on his windowsill, of the dumplings in his mother's hands, of a life that had been sustainable because nothing in it required subjugation. He wanted to be loved without owing his autonomy in return. He asked, haltingly and directly, "Are you asking me to stay because you want me, or because you feel guilty?" Dominic's face rearranged with something like shame. "Because I want you," he said, the confession shrinking and sharpening at the same time. "Because I didn't realize how much restraint would count as rejection, and because your absence is unbearable." Lucas let that settle. He had agency in the moment, an adult who had seen the architecture of advantage and understood how easily it could be turned into coercion. Dominic's willingness to alter his life impressed him because it was tangible and costly. It was not an abstract vow, it was a practical, radical choice. He considered the offer. He thought of the months he'd spent getting used to being seen and the new vulnerabilities that caused. He thought of his mother, who had sent him off with dumplings and a scarf folded like a promise. When at last he answered, his voice was steady. "If you leave everything behind, I don't want you to do it to soothe your guilt. I want you to do it because you choose me." Dominic nodded slowly, relief and fear and hope crossing his features like weather. He reached out, this time not as an alpha asserting position but as a man asking permission, and took Lucas's hand in his. "I choose you," he said. "I choose you, Lucas Miller. Not the idea of you, not how useful you are, the person who smells like dumplings and vanilla and used printer paper." They kissed then, the first time with a measured mutual consent as deliberate as their previous cautions. It was gentle, held, and when they broke apart it was with the taste of both of them, coffee and salt and a faint, lingering candy of vanilla. The scene did not become explicit. That was never the point. The point was the mutual act. Consent spoken aloud, choices articulated, stakes acknowledged and willingly taken. They slept in the cottage that night, the field breathing quietly against the windows, and in the morning Lucas woke to the smell of bread baking and Dominic's hand interlaced with his. Word of their reconciliation did not remain private. Donna Maria, who had orchestrated the initial test and watched its edges, had her own way of ensuring things were framed with dignity. She spoke plainly in a board meeting a week later, in a tone that turned gossip toward accountability. She acknowledged the ploy of the disguise but framed it as an intervention meant to illuminate values rather than manipulate hearts. The board listened, half relieved and half astonished to be given the truth and the reasoning at once. Dominic, for his part, made changes that mattered beyond his own life. He restructured certain reporting lines and set up a transparent pathway for promotions and protections for junior staff. He formed a review committee that included non-executive members, including representatives from the foundation his mother controlled. HR expanded its remit to include regular audits on workplace culture, and an anonymous hotline was instituted, practical measures that would keep one person's ethics from being the only shield employees had. Brad's fate was quietly administrative but decisive. After further complaints and documented incidents, his role within the company was re-evaluated. He was moved to a different position outside the mergers team and required to undergo mandatory counseling and professional reskilling. The aim was not to humiliate but to place boundaries, create consequences that protected people while offering a structured path toward responsibility. The office quieted, its shape softened ever so slightly into something more humane. The small private life that had begun in the cottage expanded and deepened. Lucas and Dominic navigated the complexity of relationship under the gaze of cameras and contracts with care. The processes they built were mundane and loving. They scheduled time for each other. They negotiated how to keep space for friends. They set rules around what would and would not be discussed at work. Lucas learned the code for security doors and how to sign in at the parking gate. Dominic learned the art of asking rather than assuming, how to say, "Do you want me to come?" rather than simply stepping in. Food remained a language between them. Lucas made lasagna once for Dominic, an imperfect version using a supermarket sauce and his mother's folded technique, while Dominic preheated the oven and threaded rosemary into a loaf that smelled like rain and bread. They fed each other small things, a spoonful of stew at midnight, a biscuit with coffee, a dumpling warmed in the pan until the edges curled. These tiny rituals stitched their days together better than any corporate memo could. Time moved forward in patient increments. The merger completed. Vanguard Holdings, under Dominic's new cultural steering and Donna Maria's influence, instituted an internship fund for local schools and a mentoring program that paired junior staff with impartial executive sponsors to avoid favoritism. The company building became more plant-filled, not as a token, but as a deliberate effort to make offices that felt less like cages and more like living places. The 40th floor's cleaning team received a raise. Rosa, once the broom-swinging alias, was acknowledged in a public staff memo that thanked Rosa and our facilities team for quiet work that kept the company dignified. No one pretended the transformation was overnight. It was slow, hard, and bureaucratic, but it was change anchored to policy rather than rhetoric. Lucas and Dominic's relationship matured as intricately as the plants on the 50th floor. They moved in together months later into a flat near the river where the smell of bread from a nearby bakery mixed with the river's dampness, and they turned domesticity into a practice. They argued about trivial things, whose turn it was to water the plants, whether to buy the bigger pot for the snake plant. and they comforted each other when heavier things intruded. When Lucas's mother came to visit, she bought a bag of herbs and a scarf and, with practical softness, folded it into Dominic's coat pockets as if to mark him as family. The three of them, Lucas, Dominic, and Donna Maria, found a new equilibrium. Donna Maria, for all her initial secrecy, enjoyed the quiet pleasure of a match that had been made with strategy and human decency. She took Lucas aside more than once to ask, in a voice that carried the authority she could never quite shed, "Are you being treated with fairness?" Lucas's answer was honest, and often involved mention of dumplings and plant cuttings, and the way Dominic left the window cracked for him when he was anxious. Donna Maria listened, and then she did the motherly thing. She corrected and praised in equal measure. Pregnancy came later, after the couple had negotiated their private boundaries under the microscope of corporate life. Lucas found out with a mixture of precise planning and wild joy, a test taken shyly on a Tuesday morning, the faint antiseptic smell of the kit, and then his own breath catching as he told Dominic. They decided openly how they would navigate parental leave, how they would balance work and care, how they would set up a fund to support employees who needed flexibility for family reasons. Their plans were not naive. They were practical commitments, contracts of the heart that were as procedural as any merger clause. When their son Leo arrived, he smelled like newborn breath and the faint sweetness of bread. Both men hovered with the clumsy reverence of first-time parents. In the hospital room, where the sterile smell seemed to magnify every small scent, Lucas watched Dominic as the man held the child with a tenderness that made him pulseless with gratitude. The protection Dominic had once delivered through policy now came in soft nocturnal feeding schedules and a weary, blessed patience at 3 a.m. Back at the office, the culture had shifted into new rituals. The mergers team had a nursery on call for emergencies. Intern recruiting focused on people from diverse neighborhoods and not just alumni networks. The company established a foundation named for Donna Maria's late husband, something that would funnel grants into small business training and worker dignity programs. Plants proliferated in the glass tower. A courtyard garden was added to the 50th floor. The scent of vanilla and bread did not wholly replace the metallic note of ambition, but it threaded through the building like a new, deliberate identity. There were setbacks, policy rollouts that required edits, moments of rumor when office gossip tried to reassert itself. But the foundation of change was not sentimental. It was bureaucratic, enforceable, and built on choices Dominic and Lucas had lived through. They insisted on accountability and created structures that ensured fairness. They insisted on consent and baked it into how the company handled interpersonal relationships. And when younger employees asked them on panels how to survive and flourish, they answered with honesty and a measure of humility. Keep your agency, call for help when needed, and do not trade your dignity for opportunity. Donna Maria's love trap, the phrase took shape in tabloids and in quieter, admiring boardroom whispers, remained controversial to some. Critics said it was a manipulative gambit. Supporters framed it as motherly strategy turned corporate activism. Lucas knew both truths, that she had played a deliberate role and that her choices had led to his being noticed, and to a set of consequences that had made the workplace safer. They argued in private sometimes about the ethics of her initial disguise. She listened. She owned what needed owning. She did not apologize for wanting a world that recognized the small things that needed protecting. She insisted, with the same neatness she brought to her gloves and her speeches, that people be allowed the dignity of correction and recognition. Years later, when their son Leo was old enough to smear jam across high chairs and laugh as crumbs rained down in little avalanches, the family returned to the office for a small ceremony, inaugurating a new wing dedicated to employee well-being. The room was lined with the same plants that had once softened Dominic's office, and a small plaque, wooden and warm, bore the foundation's name. Donna Maria stood at the podium and, without grandstanding, told a story about noticing, about how sometimes power needed to be used to protect the small things, and how sometimes the small things could change the trajectory of a life. Lucas watched from the front row, Dominic's hand tucked into his, and he smelled vanilla and coffee and the distant sweetness of bakery dough. Leo toddled in a little vest, his hair sticking up like a small, determined hedge. People cheered politely, some genuinely, some because public ceremonies have their own protocols. But the real applause lived in gestures. A young intern being praised for a careful correction, a cleaning team receiving an award for long service, an HR director smiling like someone who had fought for a policy and won. In the quiet of their home that night after Leo had been bathed and put to bed, Lucas and Dominic sat at the kitchen table with 2 slices of warm bread between them. They spoke of small things, plant cuttings and a book club Dominic had secretly joined to learn the language of poetry Lucas liked. They argued fondly over the best way to fold a dumpling. Above them, the river glowed like a ribbon. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked suddenly, a real question born of nights when consequence had weighed heavy. Dominic considered. "Sometimes I regret the ways I should have acted sooner," he admitted. "But not this life. Not you." Lucas reached for his hand and squeezed. He thought of the broom and the scarf and the mask that had been removed in a conference room. He thought of his father's hands in the soil, his mother's flower-streaked thumbs, and the layers of care that had made him who he was. He thought, with a steady gratitude, how the world had been altered not by a single grand gesture but by a dozen domestic ones. A plate of lasagna left on a desk, a plant rescued from neglect, a scarf folded and passed, a policy written and enforced. Outside the city breathed, and somewhere in the glass tower the lights shone soft on the plants now thriving in office windows. The scent motif of their life, vanilla and bread, storm air and coffee, wove into everyday rituals. It became less about proof and more about belonging. If this story has reached you, if the small acts matter, subscribe for more original BL stories and join our community for early access and exclusive content.